everyone, and welcome to the India Climate Dialogues hosted by the City Climate Alliance at the National Institute of Urban Affairs. The India Climate Dialogue is an ongoing series of dialogues with our Alliance network partners, where together we attempt to create meaningful and actionable conversations. The topic that we are discussing today is City Climate Action Plans, looking back and ahead. India's target is to reach net zero emissions by 2070. To reach this, it is crucial that cities which are experiencing extreme climate events, whether it's flooding, drought, or even extreme heat, are part of the action plan. Several cities in India are in the process of actively putting together climate action plans to meet emission targets and to adapt to climate change. This partners dialogue involves talking to three fantastic practitioners who are actually working with cities and hand-holding them to walk this through. They will help us briefly understand the challenges, the realities, and what lies ahead in climate action planning today. To discuss this, we have with us Soumya Chaturvedula, Deputy Director, ICLE South Asia, Shruti Narayan, Regional Director of South and West Asia C40, Lubena Rangwala, Program Head, Urban Development and Resilience, World Resources Institute. And I'm your moderator, Saili Mankikar, Head of the City Climate Alliance at NIUA. Welcome everyone and thanks for joining. Let me first come to Soumya. And ICLE has been working with several cities, and the vast experience that she has in this will really help us answer the first question. So Soumya, so many cities are working on CAPs, climate action plans. What are the steps in implementing CAPs, and are we on the right path? Because every city is looking at CAP as the tool to achieve net zero. Your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much, Sally. I think a very pertinent question, given I think where we are today in terms of urban climate action. Definitely, I think climate action plans are the initial step, I would say, for cities to embark on what should be a cohesive, a comprehensive, and a long-term journey towards achieving net zero. We all know Government of India has the 2070 target, but that does not stop a city from achieving the target much ahead, if it is able to. And it is a possibility. There are no systemic or regulatory or related challenges that would prevent a city from doing so. That said, once cities have prepared their climate action plans, I think the immediate step is for a city to look towards the financing. And that is what the cities today are actually struggling to find, is to find the finance for large-scale climate action. While there are examples of pilot implementation here and there, the proof of the pudding is in seeing large-scale climate action, and that is being challenged by access to finance. While this is a challenge, there are also innovative approaches that cities are bringing on. And I think one of the things that cities are really doing is to tap what they have as regular financing sources. So whether it is the State Finance Commission grant, whether it is mission grants that they're getting, either through the Smart Cities Mission or through the Amrut or through the Swachh Bharat Mission, or even municipal finance from their own budgets, right? So they are able to pull this finance that is available to them and to see how this finance can be channeled to develop climate resilient projects. So I think first off, when cities are developing their climate action plans and when they're prioritizing their climate actions, it would serve them well to kind of do this matchmaking of where do my existing financing sources lie, and what can I tap to actually build climate resilient infrastructure. Because here in India, we do not want to, build infrastructure and then try and see how we make it more climate resilient. How do we make it serve our adaptation needs? What we need to do today, since a lot of our cities are building infrastructure for the first time, that gives us an opportunity to already bring in and design for climate resilient infrastructure. And therefore, they're also able to tap these infrastructure funds that cities regularly have access to. So that while is an opportunity, I think that is also a point of thought for the financing institutions. So whether the funds are coming from the state or the funds are coming from the center, it would serve the cities well if the climate resilience aspect is already built in to the devolution of these funds. So, that kind of ties everything together, and that gives it a very strong push towards implementation of the caps. I wouldn't say that we are at the place where we want to be, but we are also not, our cities are not really languishing as well. A lot of cities, especially thanks to the Smart Cities mission and the other large-scale missions that are going on, and this entire thrust that is being, and the kind of capacities that are being built towards climate action in cities. So cities are able to make those linkages and start on implementation of the caps, but I think we still have a long way to go there.
Thank you, Soumya. And I think you actually, laid down the whole, you just hit the crux of it all. I think financing becomes such a crucial issue when we are talking to about caps. And cap itself is a very complex process if we look at, so that's where I want to bring Shruti in. Shruti, drawing from your global experiences and C40, how do you assess the current system from that perspective, from probably a comparative perspective? And do you recommend any move to a more comprehensive framework or a different approach, or you think the current approach is the way to go ahead?
Thank you, Saili, and totally agree the context setting that Soumya has done. I'm just going to take a step back and maybe kind of outline 4 or 5 points that I think are critical when we are looking at climate action plans, right? I think it's very important for us to understand that climate action plans should not be looked at as a parallel or, as an academic exercise or a research exercise. I think we are at an inflection point in the world where we cannot ignore that we are facing a very imminent climate crisis. And the way cities function, they have to pretty much mainstream climate action, right? So every single rupee that is spent by the city or every infrastructure that is planned has to have that climate lens. So it cannot be 2 separate things. But number 1 point that I would like to make is that we have to start looking at climate action plans in a more holistic ways, right? Where we are looking at health, equity, we're looking at, economic recovery, job creation, engagement of stakeholders like the youth, elderly, children, and that is very important, right? For example, just as an example, in London, for example, the ultra low emission zones that were created in 2019 and expanded in 2021 were able to sort of almost bring down the the nitrogen dioxide levels by almost 30 to 40%, right? Averting almost 300,000 asthma related cases, 1 million potential hospitals. So it's important to understand that the decisions that are taken are not just they're very linked to how we live, right? And I think that needs to start coming forward, right? The second aspect is that we need to start looking at how we are addressing resilience and mitigation together, right? I mean, often climate action plans tend to focus on mitigation, and I think we forget that we're facing a crisis almost every day, right? I mean, when monsoons hit India or when, heat, I mean, it's been sort of the most, we know that 1/3 of the world may become unlivable, right? I mean, a significant part of India will not be livable anymore, right? Heat stress is really increasing. So how are we addressing that? And I think Soumya addressed them quite well, right? There are 2 ways to look at it. One is how are we future-proofing our infrastructure that is built already or is going to be built? And the second aspect is how are we creating modalities and frameworks of reacting to these things immediately? Okay, I'll give you another example. For example, in Barcelona, it created a network of cool shelters to address the heat, right? In a way where businesses, etc., or malls, or places which have cool, spaces, how can citizens access them really quickly? So they said that, okay, our goal is like almost 100%, but now I think they've reached almost about 90% people can access by walk these cool, shelters within, about 10 minutes. And that is very important for us to, so how do we bring stakeholders from, the city together? So it's very important to bring the youth, the private sector, the businesses together, right? So this is important for us to understand that climate action plans are stakeholder driven, right? And owned. The city cannot be the only stakeholder in this, right? So we need to start looking at them from a very comprehensive way. What is the role of the private sector, right? The city can say that it should be net zero, but ultimately a lot of delivery of buildings is happening by the private sector, right? So what role do they play? The city can say that we will mandate, buses, but how are we moving, right? How many people are moving to the buses? So all of this integration is very, very important. The third aspect that I want to lay down is that in C40, we look at climate action plans in a framework, right? We have what we call them the leadership standards. All our cities need to adhere to those. And they are structured on 5 pillars, which are plan, deliver, mainstream, innovate, and lead, which means that there has to be a constant movement, right? Climate action plans cannot be the end and be all. We have to consistently and constantly push to innovate, to lead, to kind of say what's next, right? And that kind of comes to my sort of the last point that I want to make, which is focused on financing, which I think Soumya really laid the ground on, that at the end of the day, financing is very, very important, right? I mean, you look at it in 2 ways, right? It's an opportunity. I mean, businesses will be in it if there is a business case, and there is a clear business case. There has been reports by the World Bank and several other organizations that are into the financial sector, that this is a 23 trillion or I don't know, the number keeps increasing. Like every time I look at a new report, it's gone up by like not billions, but trillions. So there's clearly an opportunity there, right? How are we unlocking that? Then, what are we looking at from a city's perspective, where we, C40 is undertaking a pilot with the city of Oslo. WRI is working very closely with Mumbai to support them. They're one of the pilot cities on what we call the climate budgeting, where we're actually working with the city to really integrate budgeting as a part of how they look at their financing, right? Municipal budgeting. And that's very important. And that brings me back to my point of every rupee needs to have that climate lens. We cannot spend money without knowing what impact it's going to have. So I think I would say that's the way to start looking at climate action plans in a very data-driven, scientific-based, evidence, approach that becomes a starting point that's sort of laid in context of these other important issues that we have to consistently and constantly work towards.
Thank you, Shruti. I think you really brought it out well, that a climate action plan is not something that we can look at in isolation. It has to be everyone and everything coming together and everyone working together, and also us not looking at it as something that is extra, but something that is a part of the system. So I think very well said. So that's where I think, and since you mentioned, Mumbai as a case study, and we are talking about Indian cities also, I think I'd like to bring Lubaina in here, who's actually working in Mumbai on the climate action plan. So Lubaina, getting into the, the granularity of this and your Mumbai experience, are there any tried, tested, impactful actions that cities can prioritize within each of the biggest emitting sectors, or is localization the key here? How have you done it in Mumbai?
I think, I mean, two sort of broad approaches that we followed. One was, just as a sort of approach was to go back to the basics. I mean, I think we have been talking about sustainable development for a few decades now, and it is in some sectors very, very sort of structured, even in the ways in which a lot of the missions are, JNNURM over the years, how it has been structured, the ways in which, money has been sort of sanctioned towards infrastructure projects, bringing attention to public transport, to sustainable buildings. These have been conversations that have been very well established. I think what is also happening simultaneously is that there is also a sort of shift towards big projects, or high technology driven solutions that kind of increase the pace of action. So for example, in the waste sector, we've been talking about segregation, we've been talking about awareness towards reducing waste in cities, really sort of thinking about careful consumption for years. And as a culture, we are people who have always used things to the last kind of element of its use value. But with a lot of focus on waste to energy in a lot of cities, and especially small cities, that shift has not been a very productive one, right? Because what you are then doing when you rely on solutions like waste to energy is that you're really getting a lot of small cities to produce more waste to be able to feed the plant that is the white elephant in the city. So understanding that some of these technologies may work in big cities like Mumbai, where you really have to, the big focus is to close down the landfills. So those solutions work best in that context, but may not work in a small city that is not producing that kind of waste. So being able to then, even educate across sectors. So I think our big approach was where do we use some of these solutions intelligently to resolve the bottleneck in a particular sector, but not taking away the hard work, taking away from the fact that we need to do as a community of diverse stakeholders, which Soumya and Shruti were also pointing out on, that it's a community of diverse stakeholders that have to work together on climate action in cities. So in the energy sector, I mean, there's a lot of evolution that is happening on renewable energy, non-conventional energy sources, and that is the big sector that needs to that we need to kind of focus on, because in across the board, our at least in Mumbai, our biggest kind of emitting sector is the energy sector, where 95% of our energy is coming from thermal sources. But while we focus on things that are beyond the city's jurisdiction, as the big sort of action that needs to happen, and it will require a lot of like investment and transition to take place. We also cannot forget the building sector, which is really also a big sector, wherein for decades we've been talking about vernacular architecture, we've been talking about traditional building materials, practices that really sort of skill labor to be able to build buildings that have better light and ventilation conditions. In Mumbai, one of the sort of actions actually focuses in the energy and building sector focuses on thermal comfort, and the fact that if you don't really bring in that resilience lens to designing affordable housing, you're essentially overloading high energy consumption costs to low income populations that are going to be living in these buildings in the future. So it really requires you to relook at some of these slum rehabilitation guidelines, MADA EWS building guidelines, because for years we've been only looking at housing from how many people need to be housed in a unit, and very sort of these normative values, wherein building regulations have been constantly relaxed to accommodate more and more densities, and that has not really borne out to allow for livable typologies that are climate resilient. So really sort of some of the actions that we've been talking about is actually going back to the basics and going back to certain, public transport, for example, if you look at the transport sector only from a decarbonization lens, you then end up with talking about only, the EV transition. But you miss out then some of the important pieces, like how do you resolve parking in the city, which is very much a problem of mobility. How do you, in a city like Mumbai, where 70% plus 70 to 80% of the population use public transport, how are we, through the agency that a climate action plan provides to the city, how are we being able to talk about multimodal integration, or how are we able to look at the mobility sector as more a system design sector, rather than just, again, the VKT calculation that we end up with, as people trying to resolve the emission problem. And so then seeing these as sort of more complex systems that need to be resolved at end to end, so that overall your trip from door to door ends up becoming more sustainable, and the overall sort of well-being and livability standards also increase. So I think that's been sort of one important sort of approach. And second, as I was saying, as Shruti was also talking about, that really bringing in the mitigation and adaptation actions together in some of these sectors, across waste, mobility, and energy, really looking at what are sort of the co-benefits of developing well, and how do you then really build on those narratives, like even in the waste sector, really talking about just transitions, green jobs, really sort of bringing in, so much of our labor that is invested in the waste sector is actually informal and really has very poor standards of social security. So how do you bring them into the formal labor cycle through this as an opportunity, to segregate, to be able to build those systems that are easier for everyone to follow, better waste management in the city. So I think, that's been, sort of, so I don't have, 5 clear, like this is what cities should do, but broadly I think this is where what our approach in Mumbai has been, is to kind of build in the resilience narrative as we focus on mitigation, and to not forget the basics while we kind of talk about new technologies. We also sort of in the Mumbai CAP, we focused on greening as a, we did a sort of just a very like satellite data based tree count, and talking about the sort of sequestration benefit of focusing on greening as a strategy. But while again that narrative was being built up to focus on blue-green systems, we also sort of spoke about which are areas, which are the heat hotspots in the city. Where do you then focus on thinking about greening solutions, rather than it just becoming again a count of like these many trees equals this much sequestration, and that becoming again a maladaptive strategy, focusing also sort of on the adaptation potential of trees and green cover and blue cover in the blue ecosystems in the city. So yeah.
Thank you, Lubena, for giving us a kind of a deeper view into the granularity of things that are that you are implementing in Mumbai. And now I'd like to come back to Soumya, actually, because I'm just picking up certain points that have come up in the discussion with both Shruti and Lubena. And I see a lot of, talk about equity, social, health, and all these factors. One is, of course, the finance, which is the big question. But the other part is incorporation of all of this. So, Soumya, I wanted to ask you, how are cities really, and you were talking in your opening remarks about innovative approaches. So how have cities, can you give us some examples in India where cities have really been able to, not only Mumbai, but even smaller cities, are there any good examples that you can share with us where there is a good balance that is sort of, and also equity is an important part of CAPS? Is there any good example that you could share with us?
Sure, Sally. There are several opportunities, I think, in cities to bring in and to ensure that there is social equity. And one is the primary role of local authority, of any government authority for that matter, is to look at social equality, but also equity in access. So when we're talking equity, it is there are multiple dimensions to equity. So there is equity in access to infrastructure. There is equity in terms of economic participation. There is equity in terms of service delivery itself. So there are various entry points when we're talking equity in a city. And through the climate lens, the cities have several opportunities to do this. For example, a city like Udaipur is right now looking at, while they're developing their climate action plan, this is already their second generation climate action plan, but they're already looking at the access and the impacts actually of, so there are multiple things happening here, right? So there is the impact of long heat stress, long periods of heat stress, longer than what it used to be. There is this impact of having high intensity, short duration rainfall. And then there are all the needs of a special interest group that the city wants to address is children. So everybody below 95 centimeters is the focus. So they want to look at children and the access of all these services, the impact that climate has, and how is it that they can improve access to playing areas, improve access to educational institutions, the design of transport infrastructure, making it child friendly. So when you're talking children, you're also talking caregivers. So to make it more friendly for caregivers. So this is one example of how a city can address infrastructure while addressing aspects of climate impacts and ensuring that there is equity for this specific group. Another example I can give you is on in the waste sector specifically. So these are smaller cities, Udaipur, Coimbatore. They're not the Mumbai's, but Coimbatore is now reaching 2 million. 1.5 million plus. Udaipur is much smaller, I think now would be about 600,000 around, if I'm not wrong. So these are cities which are grappling with the waste situation. Both cities have looked at the greenhouse gas footprint of their existing landfills, but also looking at what the GHG emission impact would be of different technologies. But while they're doing all of this, they recognize that there is this entire informal sector that needs to be brought in. So while they are coming up with this technology, which is more advanced than what exists in the city, so they're looking at biomethanation plants or not the incineration plants that Lubena was talking about. So while they're doing this, they're training the women's groups to actually be able to manage, to be able to operate, and also to a certain extent to repair these facilities. So you are also transitioning the existing informal group, you're giving them formal employment, but also transitioning their skills, in the progression of being more skilled. So you are also creating skills which would bring them greater monetary benefits, right? So you are increasing their skill level. And so this is an interest group in terms of, the women's group that they're looking at. There are cities, for example, right now, Tiruchirappalli, for example, is looking to build a library, is looking to build. So Tamil Nadu has come up with this aspect that there should be knowledge centers and libraries in each of the cities in Tamil Nadu. And so, multiple facets. So green building design, right? But who needs to be who needs to have this expertise? It is actually the construction workers who need to know how to work with this building material selection. So this is an opportunity where while they're looking at building management systems, they're looking at material which would, increase the thermal comfort, which would reduce heat ingress, all of that. There is also this component where you're actually giving practical training to the construction workers. So that is another group where you're building skills so that moving on, when they go forward and through the entire professional life, you're building their skills to construct climate resilient buildings. So it is all very nice for the local government to aim for a platinum LEED rating, but at the same time, you're building local skills and skills of that economic strata, which would benefit the maximum. So, and which would also have then a multiplier effect within the society, because they're then involved in further construction, etc. So this is one way that that cities can bring in equity. They're doing that already. Now, whether they're doing it from the perspective of wanting to build equity, or they're doing it from a perspective of building in more efficiency, making it, looking at the replicability of it, bringing in economies of scale and all of this. So, marrying this social need of ours and our social ambition of of increasing equity within the society, you marry it with all the other practical aspects, and then you have a very nice case which then becomes organic. Otherwise, what we tend to do is bring in equity, bring in gender as some kind of superficial layer, and that doesn't really work. So I think the challenge also for partners like us is to pick up these stories and to shine light and say, you're doing it anyway, but in the process, this is what you're doing. So can you build in these design elements to other work that you're already doing? So these are certain things. Also, one point, not really on the equity, but while Lubaina was talking, is the intersectoral integration that is required, and that is not easy in this country, be it at the national level or the local government level. The challenge remains the same, but this intersectoral integration is super important. So Lubaina was talking about transport, mobility, infrastructure. I was remembering a case from Thane where we'd worked, is the entire inter-district bus stand would get inundated when these rainfall, and the rainfall pattern is changing in Thane. So there were the flood warning systems. So for the city to make that connect and say, I want my flood warning system to work, and so that I have information as to how I route my inter-district buses, how I route my public transport. So the location of the flood sensors is selected in such a manner that they get information so that they're able to plan their mobility at least 45 minutes in advance. So this kind of integrated thinking, I think, reaps a lot of benefits, a lot of, if we would like to say co-benefits, if we want to call them that. But this kind of integrated planning and integrated thinking, I think cities are doing already. And all of these are cities that we work with, and we are seeing these. And while we may be there to facilitate, the actual ask comes from the city. So while that integration across sectors is difficult, if a city manages to do that, and that comes back to the point of stakeholder engagement, one within outside the city, but also stakeholder engagement within the city governance, be it with the city authority or the parastatal entities or all of that management. If a city is able to do well, I think they reap greater benefits when they're implementing climate action plans. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Soumya, for really. Thank you so much for laying down some very critical examples and giving whenever cities city managers actually watch this dialogue, they'll be able to pick up a lot of points because you quickly identify with existing examples. So thank you for that. And while we are talking of stakeholders, I would like to bring Shruti in here. I think leadership also, city leadership is also a very important component here, because while there can be projects and there can be very charged stakeholders who want to do a lot, I think the leadership at the top also plays a very important role. So we also see that there are a lot of successes where there are good leaders. So whether it is, right from the officials to political leaders, and that's where I want to bring Shruti in to put some light on, the role of leadership in these kind of transitions and to drive these transitions.
So Saili, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think C40's premise is the leadership commitment, right? I mean, I think we believe that it has to be a commitment on like mainstreaming climate action and really kind of making that into the agenda. And, across the conversation that we've had today till now between Soumya and Lubena, and, I think the theme of making sure that this is an integrated effort is very clear, right? It cannot be something that's looked at as a parallel thing anymore, right? And I think that level of integration and the vision and strategy can only be driven if there is the leadership that's bought into it, right? And in India, especially, it's critical, right? And complex at the same time, because our urban governance is, as we all know here, is not as straightforward, right? I mean, in other cities across the globe, you have a mayor who's a political representative, and, it becomes like an agenda. I mean, I feel like, for political representatives, including climate action, and if you see across the world, right, it's now becoming something that they are including as a part of their manifesto, right? What is then driving them to get buy-in and votes, and they have to deliver, right? I mean, so it's important to start understanding that it's such an important topic now that, leaders across the world are putting that in as a part of their manifesto. In India, we have to work with, leadership at two levels. And I mean, have been, and I'm sure everybody here, we actually have that, right? I mean, we have the governance that is leading this, like from the national government, the state government, the city government. We have to be involved across the different levels, right? Because certain decisions require the state government to be involved. And the climate action plan, requires data and evidence that comes sometimes from the national government, sometimes it's the state government, so there's a lot of effort that's integrated, and it requires this vertical integration between the different governance. But it's also, looking at the leadership between the administrative, right? Because the cities are led by the commissioners and also the technical team. And I think when, one of the points that Soumya was bringing forward was on the, on the stakeholder consultations, where you also include like the other bodies, right? Not just the city, but like the development authorities. And, so you need champions in different institutions that are, that kind of take decisions of how the city grows, right? And that's the only way you can mainstream climate, right? I mean, and I keep bringing it back to sort of looking at mainstreaming, because it's important for it to get integrated. How are we developing our master plans, right? So master planning, I think, is a great exercise, right? For us to really look at how it gets integrated within that. How are we looking at the blue-green infrastructure, the growth of the city? What are our plans? So looking at that, looking at bylaws, what kind of bylaws do we have? What kind of policies, and what kind of financing are we looking at? What kind of incentives or benefits are we providing for encouraging some of these, actions? And that typically comes from leadership. And then again on this, and I also think that it's also the private sector leadership. We've seen some really strong private sector leadership that has come forward in different, in different sectors, and that is also very important. So I think it's leadership across, right? And I just want to also emphasize one point that I really think Lubena brought out really well, was kind of going back to the basics, right? I think we can't lock ourselves into resource consumption, right? I mean, I think that's very important for us to really understand, right? And I think, and that is also very sort of a visionary thing, right? Because it becomes a dynamic, right? How do you plan development, which is all about growth and increasing footprint, but at the same time, looking at how you're not really increasing the footprint, right? So how are you doing this balancing act between going back to the basics, how do you actually design buildings that don't use as much energy as the first place, right? Instead of talking about efficient cooling, that's probably the next step, right? But what is that basic of not being able to lock in some of this, impacts into, how a city functions. So leadership is very important. C40 is a network of 100 cities where the top leaders who govern the cities have made this commitment. And, we are a membership-based, organization, as you know, and we don't charge any money. And, we have these leadership standards that the city has to adhere to, right? And clearly these cities are, coming forward and saying that they want to deliver, they want to act, they want to mainstream, they want to lead and show by action. And, so I think, leadership is a very, very key part of this equation.
Thank you, Shruti, for really highlighting about leadership at all levels and in all sections, because that's when we can really see something happening, I guess. So I'd like to come to the last question, because we are really, we have so much to talk about, but very little time. And so I would like to direct that to Lubaina. Lubaina, one thing that I would definitely like to ask you is, since you're working so much with the city of Mumbai and, working with the administration on almost a daily basis on caps, what would you highlight as some of the main pain points for administrators really when they want to take up caps? Like, what would be the problems that if you can just quickly highlight some problems that should be taken care of at a larger level, and that kind of message that you can, put ahead, what would they be?
I think there are, maybe I can talk about sort of 3 different levels. One is, in terms of just the act of planning itself, across the board, across different stakeholders, we are we are a little away from being able to come together and plan a statutory document that is, that very has well integrated a climate lens. The way that Shruti is talking about the importance of mainstreaming, I think we are a few years away from being able to really do that. But what the CAP as a sort of visionary document has allowed is a roadmap, and has for the first time for the city, created a database of evidence of a way forward, and brought these conversations on the table in a much more real way than it has happened in the past. But to be able to really sort of find, like, we keep talking about that the next DP is going to, for Mumbai, will be revised for 2034, which is based on the CAP. Our first sort of short-term targets are aimed at 2030. So are we in a position to be able to, 2034 will be the sort of review of the DP, which will look at the next 20 years, 2054, which is pretty much the end goal of the CAP, right? 2050, we have to be net zero. So are we in a position to, in the next less than 10 years, be able to review the next development plan that will bring us to, so that work has to be done like now. And I think that is the biggest challenge. I think the fact that, even administrative like the time period is the span of 3 to 5 years. And some of these challenges then don't really allow for a sort of continuous leadership, which really can kind of spearhead this long-term agenda and be able to kind of integrate. In terms of, regulations, so what happens then is there are, sectoral interventions. So in cities like Mumbai, which are very flood prone, a lot of action, lot of investment is going on flood related infrastructure. But there is not much integration with other departments that could potentially create these, nature-based solution buffers alongside the gray infrastructure. So you have other departments like the garden department, a lot of greening initiatives that are done that are not really connected with the way in which the city's drainage is being planned. It's essentially planned only from a runoff point of view. So then you have these very sort of sectoral actions that emerge, and what Soumya was talking about, the need for integration, right? Holistic solutions. That is really then the next challenge, is how do you bring these different departments together to deliver these comprehensive solutions without it being without it being a kind of stepping on some other department's toes, but being able to bring value, so I think that is again the challenge, and I think the sort of biggest piece is institutional structure. I mean, where does the cap really sit? In every city, it kind of sits in a different department based on who is more proactive and can sort of deliver a document efficiently. But that may not really be the city's environment department. It could be the disaster management department. It could be a department that has the efficiency to be able to do it, right? And I think that that is again another huge challenge, is are we then advocating, and in Mumbai we've done that. We've advocated for a climate action cell to be created as part of the environment department that then starts looking at it, because through the process of working with the Department of Environment, what we realize is that their role is essentially become about protecting the environment, protecting certain natural areas and preventing pollution, but the planning aspect completely misses, right? And so how do you build that capacity? And there is really, it comes down to the inability of the corporation to even hire officials that have the skills to be able to really mainstream a cap. So your the engineering cadre, and mostly within the corporation you essentially have mechanical and civil engineers. You don't even hire environmental engineers. They go through certain trainings or just learn on the job and become part of the sort of environment. So when you talk about sort of holistic solutions and diverse capabilities to be able to deliver on a cap, the corporation doesn't have the ability to bring in these people as on their payroll. So it's essentially a lot of the work around sustainable development is being done by consultants, and that's really it comes down to that being the biggest challenge, that internally there is no capacity to deliver. So the corporation essentially becomes an administrative body that supports the development, that supports operations, but a lot of the thinking is being done outside of the corporation, in that sense, in terms of like what are suggested solutions, what are ways in which the transitions are being planned, and really sort of like, the hope is in the next 10 years, if we can make that shift, bring in new capacities that are embedded within the corporation and through various different modalities. And that's the hope of the climate action cell, is that if that can happen, what are the ways in which we can try these out in the next couple of years, and if they are successful, then make the kind of change the mandates, bring in new cadres of officials that can start coming in. So yeah.
Thank you, Lubaina. I think that the last point was very well taken, and a great point to end with, where we must build institutional capacities that will actually kind of, take these action plans ahead, especially when we are talking of, development plans that are 20-year plans. You just need to build that cadre which will actually see it from end to end. Probably a young cadre that we need to motivate, that will actually get in with the right kind of, education qualifications also. Like you said, environmental engineers need to be there if we really need some sort of, structural change. So with that, I think we've come to the end of today's discussion, although there's so much more that we can talk and discuss. But thank you all of you great panelists, for sparing your time and being here. And to all the viewers who have tuned in today, Please stay tuned in for more such interesting discussions with the City Climate Alliance at the India Climate Dialogues. Thank you very much.